Christian philosophy is a development in philosophy that is characterized by coming from a Christian tradition. Hellenistic philosophy and early Christian philosophy. Hellenism is the traditional designation for the Greek culture of the Roman Empire in the days of Jesus, Paul, and for centuries after. Classical philosophies of the Greeks had already expired and diluted beyond recognition except for small bands of continuators of the traditions of the Pythagoreans, of Plato, and Aristotle. The new philosophies of the Hellenistic world were those of the Cynics, skeptics, and increasingly the Stoics. It's these philosophers who bring us into the world of Hellenistic philosophy. Slowly, a more integral and rounded tendency emerged within Hellenism, but also in certain respects in opposition at times to it in regard to one philosophical problem or another, or an ensemble of problems. Here are some of those thinkers most closely associated with Hellenistic Christian philosophies, listed more or less in chronological order. Justin Martyr, Christian apologist and philosopher whose work often focused on the doctrine of the Logos and argued that many Stoic and Platonic philosophical ideas were similar to ideas in the Old Testament. Tertullian. Tertullian was a philosopher before he converted to Christianity. After that change of direction, he remained a prolific writer in the 2nd century AD, and is commonly called the father of the Western Church. He was the first church father to use the term Trinitas in reference to the Godhead and developed the doctrine of traducianism, or the idea that the soul was inherited from the parents, the idea that God had corporeal existence, and the doctrine of the authority of the Gospels. He fought voraciously against Marcionism, and considered Greek philosophy to be incompatible with Christian wisdom. Toward the end of his life, he joined the heterodox sect of Montanism, and thus has not been canonized by the Catholic Church. Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus is best known for his writings arguing for the unity of God, and against Gnosticism. He argued that original sin is latent in humanity, and that it was by Jesus' incarnation as a man that he undid the original sin of Adam, thus sanctifying life for all mankind. Irenaeus maintained the view that Christ is the teacher of the human race through whom wisdom would be made accessible to all. Clement of Alexandria, theologian and apologist who wrote on Greek philosophy, using ideas from pagan literature, Stoic and Platonic philosophy, and Gnosticism to argue for Christianity. Origen. Origen was influential in integrating elements of Platonism into Christianity. He incorporated Platonic idealism into his conceptions of the Logos, and the two churches, one ideal and one real. He also held a strongly Platonic view of God, describing him as the perfect, incorporeal ideal. He was later declared a heretic for subscribing to the too Platonistic doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul. Augustine and of Hippo. Augustine developed classical Christian philosophy, and the whole of Western thought, largely by synthesizing Hebrew and Greek thought. He drew particularly from Plato, the Neoplatonism of Plotinus, and Stoicism, which he altered and refined in light of divine revelation of Christian teaching and the Scriptures. Augustine wrote extensively on many religious and philosophical topics. He employed an allegorical method of reading the Bible, further developed the doctrine of hell as endless punishment, original sin as inherited guilt, divine grace as the necessary remedy for original sin, baptismal regeneration and consequently infant baptism, inner experience and the concept of self, the moral necessity of human free will, and individual election to salvation by eternal predestination. He has been a major influence in the development of Western theology in his thought, and in particular his works, City of God and Confessions, laid the foundations for Western philosophy, influencing many of philosophers and making him one of the most influential figures in the history of philosophy. Athanasius of Alexandria, father of Trinitarian orthodoxy involved in the formation of the Nicene Creed, who vehemently opposed Arius, the Bishop of Alexandria, who held that Christ was a created being, and his following Dioscorus of Aphrodite, Gaius Marius Victorinus, Nemesis, John Chrysostom, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, the Cappadocian Fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Basil the Great. Medieval Christian philosophy. Peter Abelard. Abelard was a leading 12th-century philosopher and theologian, best known for his association with conceptualism and his development of the moral influence theory of atonement. Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm is best known for the ontological argument for God's existence, i.e., God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, but to exist is greater than not to exist. If God does not exist, then he wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be conceived, therefore, God exists. Anselm's argumentation was used as a theological directive for conceptualizing divine perfection. He was one of the first Western thinkers to directly engage the reintroduction of Aristotle to the West. However, he didn't have all of Aristotle's works, and those he had access to were from Arabic translations and Islamic commentaries. Also developed the satisfaction theory of atonement. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was the student of Albert the Great, a brilliant Dominican experimentalist, much like the Franciscan Roger Bacon of Oxford in the 13th century. Aquinas synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christianity. He believed that there was no contradiction between faith and secular reason, but that they complemented each other epistemically. He thought Aristotle had achieved the pinnacle of human striving for truth apart from divine revelation, and thus adopted Aristotle's philosophy as a framework in constructing his theological and philosophical outlook. Thomas Aquinas was a professor at the prestigious University of Paris, a contemporary of Bonaventure, a Franciscan professor at the University of Paris whose approach differed significantly from Aquinas in favor of the more traditional Augustinian Platonism. Widely accepted as one of the most influential figures in the history of philosophy, his philosophy is the foundation for Thomism. His most famous work is Summa Theologica. William of Ockham, philosopher and theologian who developed Ockham's razor and wrote extensively on metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, theology, logic, and politics. John Duns Scotus. John Duns Scotus is known as the subtle doctor, whose hair-splitting distinctions were important contributions in scholastic thought and the modern development of logic. Scotus was also a professor at the University of Paris, but not at the same time as Aquinas. Along with Aquinas, he is one of the two giants of scholastic philosophy. Albert of Saxony, Alcuin of York, Adelard of Bath, Petrus Aureolus, Boethius, Bonaventure, Roger Bacon, Gabriel Biel, Hildegard of Bingen, John Blund, Sigurd of Brabant, Thomas Bradwardine, Adam de Buckfield, Jean Buridan, Walter Burley, Saint Catherine of Siena, Juan de Celaya, William of Conches, Cesare Cremonini, Henry Ercley, Vincent Ferrer, Godfrey of Fontaine, Francis of Marcia, Gornilo of Marmothis, Giles of Rome, Gregory of Rimini, Robert Grosseteste, Henry of Ghent, Jerome Leocator, John of Paris, Johannes Scotus Eriugena, Marsilius of Ingen, Albertus Magnus, John Mayer, Richard of Middleton, Robert of Milan, Hervaeus Natalis, Francisco Suarez, Paul of Venice, Francisco de Vitoria. Renaissance and Reformation Christian philosophy. Jacobus Arminius, a preacher, theologian, and church court operative. Jean Bodin, French legal scholar and political philosopher, he wrote widely in a number of areas. Desiderius Erasmus was not a philosopher strictly speaking. Indeed, he wrote excoriatingly about philosophers. He consolidated the space of humanism in the late medieval scholarship of letters, and came to represent its acme. He was a leader of the development of the humanities into a department of European scholarly activities. He bent his studies to recovery and exegesis of the Hebrew Bible's ancient languages and began building the first critical text, and the New Testament became a formal scholarly text. He wrote about issues relevant to the Catholic Church and its ignorance. He spent 6 years in an Augustinian monastery. He was a joyful satirist, and became most famous for his book The Praise of Folly. Hugo Grotius. His early work on the law of the seas was outdistanced by On the Law of War and Peace. Martin Luther, also not strictly a philosopher, he knew something of William of Ockham and nominalist epistemology from an earlier era of European thought. He had also studied some philosophical materials of Augustine of Hippo, and did not follow Thomas Aquinas. Luther followed Erasmus in developing a critical text of the biblical manuscripts. Luther went a step beyond Erasmus in actually translating the Bible into the vernacular. Luther's German Bible had a tremendous impact on the development of the German language and its literature. John Calvin. Calvin was a dogmatician, as exhibited in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, and an exegeter who over time translated the Bible from their original languages, in the form of his grand series of commentaries on all but one of its books. He courageously tried to avoid allegorizing, which had had a long history ever since Philo of Alexandria had interpreted the Pentateuch in an allegorical fashion that alliteralized and over-metaphorized many passages of the ancient manuscripts of the Bible. Calvin tried to distance himself from the allegorical method of Christian interpretation of the Bible, attempted distance certainly from the method's primacy, while facing in the Gospels the parabolic message of the cross. Not strictly a philosopher, he had a major impact on the quest for a Protestant philosophy. Calvin's seed begat reformational philosophy 450 years after he planted it. Marsilio Ficino, influential Italian humanist philosopher who revived Neoplatonism and was a leader in the Renaissance, translated all of Plato's and Plotinus' works into Latin, as well as many Neoplatonic authors and the Corpus Hermeticum. He also wrote many commentaries on Plato and Christian authors as Pseudo-Dionysius. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Italian philosopher who was a major figure in the Renaissance. At the age of 23 he proposed 900 theses on religion, natural philosophy and magic, writing the Oration on the Dignity of Man, which was a central text in Renaissance humanism and has been called the movement's manifesto. Huldrych Zwingli was a leading reformer who was influenced by a party in his church congregation to demetaphorize the understanding of the Lord's Supper into a memorial only. In most cases, these writers reference something in an earlier philosopher, without adding to the ongoing problem historical shape of Western philosophical knowledge. Between Calvin and Arminius, born 4 years before Calvin's death, a Protestant scholasticism took from various loci and authorities of the Western Middle Ages. It begins already with Luther's colleague Philip Melanchthon, who turned from Luther's sola scriptura to philosophical theology, but Protestant scholasticism's reformed variants are diverse. There were no real alternatives until Hermann Duewid and D. H. T. H. Wallenhoven in the last century.